Okay, this is just gonna be a video on crosshair placement, and then a bit of spraying as well. Just generally how you practice these things and how to get better at it. There's a lot of things you can practice like by just playing the game. For example, like flicking, like just general game sense. A lot of these come from just playing the game, and you can also there's a lot of third party softwares like Game Labs and yeah, those that helps you practice those things. But there's one thing that you can never practice with anything else rather than just purely thinking about it, and that's crosshair placement. You can play literally 10,000 games. If you're not actively thinking about where your crosshair placement should be, you're literally never going to get better at that. So some of the common mistakes I see, for example, in a quarter like this, right? Let's say you're about to peek this position right here. If you think someone's maybe holding this angle, right? I'm peeking it like this, right? My crosshair placement, I'm not aiming at this right here because, okay, you can aim at this up all the way until you walk to this corner and you're about to peek, and then you adjust your crosshair placement on where you're gonna aim in the future, right? A lot of new players and people who are not actively thinking about this, they'll hold this corner and then they'll peek like this, right? But you're already exposed, so like by the time you're peeking out, if you're peeking out like this, right, you're changing your crosshair placement during your peek so they can see you before your crosshairs on them. You don't want to do that. You want to, before you peek any corner, you want to think about what are the angles, and you want to make quick adjustments. So like I'm preferring, like let's say I'm trying to aim for that spot, my crosshair is on the wall before I peek that corner. That way it's a lot easier to do this. And then, so let's say you peek this corner, you don't see anybody. You want to peek this corner right here, right? So instead of doing this and then doing this, right? Like you see how my crosshair placement is changing while I was already exposed. You can peek like this, switch it, and peek like that. It's a lot of new players, inexperienced FPS players will make this mistakes of like, this is what's called a bad crosshair placement, not because your initial crosshair is bad, but more actively, like more so that like you're not thinking about how your crosshair is going to change over time. This is way more prevalent in Valorant too, because there's so many different elevations. Like this is not very common in CS. Like there are elevations in CS, but it's a lot more rare, I would say, and then a lot less noticeable. But in Valorant, let's say you're like peeking heaven, right? It's so much higher up there, or you're peeking to CT. I see a lot of people, like, let's say you're peeking out here, you're peeking into CT, right? Like this crosshair placement is fine. You're looking at the head. But once you're up on CT, if you just hold the same crosshair placement, now that's too low, right? You gotta constantly adjust where your crosshair placement is going to be. That way you're adapting to the situation. Your crosshair placement should never be on one angle. Like it should be changing depending on how you're peeking and how you're where you're trying to peek. Like let's say I hold this angle, my crosshair placement right here, because that's where I imagine the enemy player is going to come up, right? And if I'm peeking down there, my crosshair placement is no longer looking at this. Let's look at it. I keep the same crosshair placement. I look there, like crosshair placement is way off. I'm looking straight at their feet, right? So even before you peek anything, I'm adjusting my crosshair placement, and now I'm peeking. And then if someone's there, I like it's in there. It's close to where their head's going to be, instead of peeking like this, right? And then flicking up. See so many people make this mistake, and it's like you should really. It's more so at the end of the day, just thinking about the decisions you're making, thinking about where your crosshair is going to be at the beginning, because you're so focused on your crosshair placement. You're gonna lose some fights because you're just not reacting to the things that's right in front of you because you're thinking about this too much, right? So like if I'm peeking here, and then let's say I'm like, hey, this is a bad crosshair placement, I move it up. Sometimes someone will peek out and you'll die. But then this is a part of the learning experience, and something you need to do is you at the beginning you're gonna lose gunfights because you're thinking about your crosshair placement. But it's kind of like correcting a bad habit. You're just eventually gonna have to be able to do it. And then another thing, since we're on the topic of peeking, is counter strafing and the lack thereof in Valorant. People keep telling you that you need to hold D, and then the moment you're about to shoot, you need to press A, and you shoot. That mechanic is from CSGO, and it's actually not a part of Valorant. So it's still fine to do, like, because the fact A stops all of your momentum, theoretically it's still in the game. But you don't, like, a lot of new players, they'll hold D and they'll hold A, and then they're just never accurate. So like a easier way to do this in this game is just hold D and let go when you're about to shoot. It's the same either way, right? Like, there's slight difference. There's like literally no difference if I'm just holding D, letting go, and then holding D and pressing A. So you really don't need to be doing what's called a quote unquote counter strafing. You just need to know, like, you need to let go of the D key or whichever movement key you're holding by the time you're firing. It's not as complicated in CS, and it's a lot easier to learn, which is pretty much this entire game. But yeah, if someone tells you, oh, you need to counter strafing, they're wrong, because it's not technically programmed into the game. But you could do it if pressing the opposite direction key is more comfortable to you. Then by all means go ahead. There's no disadvantage of doing counter strafing. But you also, if you're finding counter strafing very hard to do, just simply let go of whatever movement key. Getting a habit of literally training your hand to let go of all movement keys on your left hand, because that's where you're pressing WSD for most people, and then shoot. Like, just keep practicing, like, letting go movement key and then shoot, or left clicking with your right hand, and eventually become muscle memory, right? So peeking, actively use not counter strafing, but letting go of your movement key before you fire is pretty important. And lastly, it's just gonna be spray patterns. So spray patterns, a lot of people think that if you just go into a custom game and you just do this, right, you're gonna learn eventually. You constantly think about it, you're just eventually going to learn spray patterns. That's completely right, but it takes a lot more practice than you would think. Because of the fact that when you're in a gunfight, it's non-natural for you to be thinking about things. Like, you're not going to be thinking of a strat while you're in the middle of a gunfight, because you're completely focused. You need to practice spray patterns enough to the point where it's completely muscle memory what you're doing. So the phantom spray pattern is up to the right and then a bit, and then more to the left. So it's kind of like, so when you're doing it, you kind of want to do like a reverse 7, right? That way it's what you like. So like, if I'm actively thinking about it, right? If I'm actively thinking about it, the spray's gonna be fine every single time. But like, if I'm not like in a gunfight, in a real life scenario, you're not gonna be thinking about your spray pattern. So you need to practice spraying enough to the point where it becomes muscle memory, that every time you pick up a phantom and you shoot more than one bullet, your mouse is just going that direction automatically. And this sounds very hard, like to train your hand to do that, but it's really not as complicated as you think. I'll say honestly, doing 50 sprays per day, like on a wall like this, right? Like, go into like the practice range, just do 50 per day. Sounds like a lot per day, but 50 literally takes 5 minutes, like, because each spray pattern is like 5-10 seconds. Helps so much with spraying. Like, spraying is like kind of a basic of the game that if someone said they're bad at, they're just not practicing it, and they're just not practicing it correctly. Right? There is no bad at spraying. This is literally just human memorization. Like, every Chinese kid can pick up a chopsticks. It's that kind of thing. You just gotta like, practice enough. There's no one in the world who doesn't get spray patterns. It's just people who choose not to practice this. Okay, that's pretty much gonna be it for the first part of the video. So, like, to summarize it, think about where you're aiming your crosshair before you peek, right? It's not gonna be perfect, but you need to think, and then you need to actively change. So like, right there, I peeked and I realized this is too high. I'm aiming at nothing, right? Every angle is different. So now, like, next time I peek this, I'm actively thinking about it needs to be lower, right? And it also depends on how far you peek. If you're wide swing, your crosshair should not be the same as if you're just like jiggle peeking like this, right? If you're wide swing, your crosshair should be like that, right? Since you're swinging all the way out. But yeah, just actively think about your crosshair placement, even if it comes at the cost of you dying, because to get into a good mindset about this kind of thing is very important early on in the game. Especially early on into learning Valorant as a game. If you just want to improve your aim, just actively think about your crosshair placement, because it's never gonna get better with your time. with time. All the DMs in the world won't fix your crosshair placement if you're not the one actively trying to fix it. And then you don't need to counter strafe, but you could if you want. And also just practicing your hand to let go of the movement key before you shoot. That way your shots are always accurate. And then lastly is just practice your spray patterns every single day until it becomes muscle memory. That way you can be better. You can be better at spraying your weapon. Like there is randomness. Obviously, the elephant in the room is that people complain about the random RNG of spray in this game. It's pretty noticeable with the Vandal, but the Phantom, realistically speaking, it's not like, unless you're a pro level player and you're like amazing at spraying like a leech is, it doesn't make the biggest difference in the world, right? Like everybody could do similar things, like as long as you have practice. Obviously, my spray pattern isn't perfect either, but it's just you keep on practicing at it until the point where you actively do it. It becomes muscle memory, and that's the point where your spray is good. Just because you pull off one perfect spray that's like a circle doesn't mean your spray pattern is gonna be actually good in game. You need to keep practicing until it becomes muscle memory. That's pretty much it.